Hiya folks, it's Kikoskia here, and welcome back to Writing and Me. This video contains no gameplay or music whatsoever, allowing you to put it in the background while you focus on whatever it is you're doing, be it writing, working, or driving your interdimensional bus through the various dimensions. If I'm to make a recommendation to you though, don't stop at the pi dimension. The pi dimension has some very bad things going on right now, and I know you may be hungry, but trust me, it's not worth it. Move on to the quiche dimension instead. It's much safer there. Last time we talked about characters, and with that we've spoken about the three main foundation blocks of a story: world building, plot, and characters. And this time we're going to focus on a certain aspect of characters, one that I know a lot of people are rubbing their hands in glee about, because it's one that they may be looking forward to, and that is character death. What is character death? The answer is deceptively simple, but it has a lot more to it. Character death is the end of a character in a story through their death, be it an accident, old age, murder, being vaporized by a wizard. They are gone. And though they are not alive anymore, they still have an impact on the story. Their death is something that other characters remember. Other characters will mourn them. Other characters will angrily rail against fate for taking away this person. Even though they aren't there, they continue to subtly guide the story, at least in the short term. In the long term, characters may slowly accept that the character is gone and continue with their life. And the death can range from a single event that occurs to the entire driving force of the story. There are quite a few plots that are propelled forward by the death of a character, and that death is what the whole story revolves around, be it the main character trying to come to terms with the death or deal with the ramifications of that death. So now we've got what character death is all about, the next question is, does your story need character death? And that entirely depends on the plot that you've written and the characters that you have. Sometimes you'll look at your story and go, actually no, my story doesn't need any character death at all, and that is no bad thing. Don't feel like you have to have characters die just because it's the kind of story that characters do die in. It doesn't have to happen. It's your story after all, you write it however you want. And if you feel like the story doesn't have to have anybody die, don't have anyone die. You may explain bits of the story to some people and they go, well, clearly somebody needs to have died at this point. Don't feel pressured by their expectations that death has to happen. You are the one that dictates how the story goes, and you are the only one who knows in your heart whether character death should occur. You can derail a story really hard by forcing character death in when you haven't planned for it. That said, sometimes, as I stated previously, you can be writing a story and not originally plan for there to be any character death, and then you look at what you've created and go, the story's sort of veering towards this character dying due to this. And if that makes more sense when you think about it, then by all means, change it and have the character die. Whatever route you end up taking to deciding that you're going to have character death, be warned that it is not easy to write, at least for me. It doesn't matter what character I'm writing for, character death is hard for me to write, even for the villains. Why? Because I created these characters, and as much as some people will look at something and go, ooh, the author must have really loved making these characters suffer and go through all these trials and tribulations, they likely didn't. I don't enjoy my characters going through misery. I don't enjoy seeing them struggle. I don't enjoy them being in pain, and I certainly don't enjoy when they die. But when the story dictates that it must happen, it must happen. As hard as it is for me to go through it, I have to do it. Because otherwise the story will get derailed, and I don't want that. So, it must be done. So let's say that you have decided to have some character death in your story. There are two things I have found that you need to do to make sure that it works in the narrative. And when I say works, I mean that when it happens, the reader goes, "Oh, oh no, no," or "Aha, yes, finally." There needs to be an emotional response to the incident for it to have any lasting impact. And there are two things you need to do to make sure that happens. Both of these things are equal to each other, though it may not seem that way when I describe the first one. For the first thing you need to do is make sure that the reader feels for that character. And when I say that, I mean that they have to have an emotional attachment in some way to the person that is dying. Be it that they have empathy for them, be it that they hate them, be it that they fear them. There has to be some emotional attachment. If you introduce a character and they're called Bob and they're a soldier, and that is literally all you learn about them before they die a chapter later, the reader isn't really going to do much apart from go, "Oh, Bob is dead. Oh well, that's sad, but eh." Because they don't know anything about Bob. They've not been given time to develop an attachment to Bob. Now, take that character again, and you're introduced to Bob again. But this time, you start learning little things about Bob. You learn that Bob has a family. You learn that Bob has a child. You learn that Bob enlisted to help defend his hometown. You learn that Bob lost his right eye, pushing his friend out of the way of an incoming arrow. You're slowly learning little bits and pieces here about this character that, no matter how minor, you now have an attachment to. It may be a tiny attachment, but these small nuggets of information give you a fleshed out character. Fleshed out characters are more likely to create an emotional attachment with the reader. And when Bob gets shot and killed this time, suddenly the reader goes, oh no, Bob! He was going to go home and spend time with his kid, and oh, Bob, no, why did you have to die? Why were you so brave? And suddenly, there you have it. You have that link. And that link is so very important. And it's something that is often overlooked when people go, well, clearly this story's great because it has lots of death in it. It's not going to be that great if all the death is of characters you don't care about because they haven't been given any time. Now, that's not to say that you should make death sparse. If your story warrants a lot of death, then a lot of death is going to happen, and provided you do give enough characterization to the people that are going to die, it's quite likely that your readers are going to care about those deaths. I'm speaking about named characters here. Nameless characters tend to die in significantly larger quantities, at least in certain forms of fiction. You're not going to have huge scores of people die in a slice-of-life story unless something really bad is happening in the background. Those stories do exist, though they are few and far between. There is a big difference between an entire squad of soldiers dying compared to an entire squad of soldiers dying, but Bob is there as well. The soldiers dying will probably provoke a brief reaction, but Bob being amongst the casualties? That's going to hit some people hard. And the more significant the character is, and the more development they've had, the more it will hit. This also applies for villains, though the reaction tends to be different. If the villain truly is a mustache-twirling villain that wants to take over the world using the power of the magical crystals, and the heroes finally manage to turn the power of the crystals against the villain, and he slowly disintegrates, lamenting that his plan has been foiled and screaming that he should be invincible, there's definitely going to be a reaction. It's probably going to be a ha-ha! Finally! You get what's coming to you for killing Bob! And there is that attachment, that emotional connection. The reader hates the villain, and so when they finally die, there is that catharsis of, finally, he's gone. Now, if you have a villain that is an unfortunate character who is only a villain due to the situation or has a story that warrants you to feel sympathy for them, then there'll be a different reaction. The reaction all depends on how they have been built up, as I've said. Bob was built up as a character who is just doing his bit, and his death is so tragic and sad, whereas the villain their death is something that you've been looking forward to for a long time. That's not to say, by the way, that a character death always has to be this epic, heroic thing, as quite often, I'm afraid, death isn't that. As Rimmer said in Red Dwarf, quite often it's mind that bus what bus splat. You get mere moments to react and no time to do anything except die. The point I'm making with this is that the death itself doesn't have to have a poignant plot meaning. But that doesn't mean it doesn't have impact. Sometimes a death in a story is just a tragic waste. It was completely avoidable. It was something that shouldn't have happened, but because of the character being in the wrong place at the wrong time, the character falsely believing that they're indestructible, or a misplaced sense of bravado, they end up in a situation that kills them. And that is tragic. But it doesn't mean it doesn't have impact. The impact of the death comes from knowing the character, not from the method, though the method can certainly add to it. You can have situations where you've known this death is coming for quite a long time because this character is expecting to die at this point. Say they know they're going to have a confrontation with this villain and they're unlikely to live, but they have to get their revenge. The story has been building up towards this death. You've had plenty of time to prepare for it. But are you truly prepared? Probably not. Whether the character dies not long after getting their revenge because of their mortal wounds, or they fail miserably to get their revenge, but they tried, that death will have a bigger impact. This brings me on to the second important part about character death, and that is that death needs weight for it to have impact. And by weight I mean a lasting permanence. If you have a setting where death is just something that happens and then you can just easily bring them back and by the next chapter everyone that's died has returned, death is going to lose its teeth really, really quickly. You're just going to look at character death and go, alright then, they're dead. They'll be back soon enough. That itself is not a bad thing. It's not something that you shouldn't write. But you should bear in mind that if death is a thing that is really easy to reverse, it's not going to have punch. And you're going to have to rely on other things to provide that punch. It may have punch the first time, or the second time it happens, but when the reader is informed that death is easily reversible and the characters will always come back, its impact is greatly diminished, if not eliminated altogether. There are stories that have the entire plot be that death is permanent, except in this case. And you have characters who go on epic journeys across the world, across the stars, to try and return someone that has died. That is how desperate some people can be to get people back that they've lost. For many people, death is a scary thing, and death is a thing that nobody comes back from. In a lot of fiction, death is permanent, and once a character is gone, that's it. They are gone. All that they've left is their body, their possessions, and memories in the minds of others. That's it. They're gone forever. And that goes back to me saying that writing death is difficult, because that permanence, that elimination of the character, most of the time, is something you can't do. They are gone. And that permanence, that finality, is what goes hand in hand with you caring about the character to give death its punch and its weight and its power. Because they aren't coming back. They are gone. Bob will never go back home and see his family ever again. He'll never again set his eyes upon his hometown. Even if his body is returned there and buried, he is gone. He's not alive anymore. There are, of course, exceptions to this. If a character becomes undead, be it a ghost or a vampire or a lich, There are also exceptions for if, say, in a setting, the soul lingers around the point of death and communicates with people to try and convey a message or give a warning or something else. There are always exceptions to death being permanent. I mean, the character is still dead, but they are still able to communicate in those instances in some form or another. The undead creature that was once Bob may not entirely be Bob. Maybe undead Bob is just a shadow of his former self, but there is still a part of that character there. In time, if undead Bob remains as a character, and you learn more and more about Bob through him being undead, Bob himself could actually then die again. Say if Undead Bob then experienced a final death at the hands of a cleric or a necromancer, twisting Bob's undead energy and then eradicating it. Undead Bob has just died, which means that the character has died twice. And even though, in that setting, death has finality, it still hit you again, and it's hit you even harder this time because Bob was able to somehow evade the clutches of death in some manner, and then it came for him anyway. Because in most settings, as I've said before, death is permanent, and death always comes. Because it's there. It's lingering. And in most instances, your characters know that it's there. There are exceptions to that, of course, as well. There are stories where characters are not going to die for many different reasons, be it that they are eternally young, or they're a different species that do not die of old age. But death is almost always something that can occur, even if the only source is that they get shot, or they get thrown into a star, or they get exposed to light, or they eat the wrong kind of cheese. There is always that spectre of death following. The sword of Damocles hovering over your head. And I know that reference is not because of death itself, but it is so often quoted when people think of it. There is that inevitability as well as the weight of its finality. Those two things combine along with the connection that you have with the character to give the character's death the wallop. And it hits you in the gut, and you go, oh, they're dead. When it has that impact, you know that you have succeeded in conveying character death in a way that is meaningful and will stay with the reader. There's one final thing I want to talk about, and that is a piece of advice that I hear quite often when I'm reading about character death or people are talking about it. And it roughly goes, if you are stuck in your story, kill a character. Take that piece of advice with a massive bucket of salt, because if you just go about killing characters erratically just because nothing's happening in the story, the reader is going to notice, and they're going to start not connecting with the characters because there's just such an erratic manner to how they die that there's really no point in doing so, because you know that they're going to die as soon as they appear, most likely. They may not die, but you start to build that expectation in your reader. They go, oh look, here's Bob. Well, he's just gonna die in a few chapters anyway, so meh. And before you know it, by just killing people because you thought, oh, this'll be exciting, it ends up doing the exact opposite, and it ends up boring the reader. Or worse, alienating the reader. And an alienated reader is very likely to put the book down and go and read something else. So be warned. Death for death's sake isn't necessarily the right thing. What that advice is there for, however, is to get you to think about character death itself, to prompt the thoughts and discussion that I've had here. And by thinking about it, maybe you'll get a new insight into your characters, and you'll see something that you didn't see before. You'll see a death that's coming that you hadn't spotted until then. And then you can start writing towards it. The advice is giving you pointers as to when it should happen, rather than saying, you should do it right now, an anvil drops from the sky and kills Bob. It's guiding you along rather than outright ordering you. And with that, I believe I've given you a good foundation to have your own thoughts about character death. Don't be afraid of it happening, but think long and hard about doing it. And remember, it's not easy. You need it to have impact from the development of the characters, and by having death have punch, have weight, have wallop and power. And if you do all of that, it's quite likely that you're going to get the reaction that you want. And so, that concludes this episode of Writing and Me. And when we come back, folks, another aspect of writing. It may be about characters again, it may be about the plot, it may be about world building, it may be about something completely different that you haven't anticipated, but is an important aspect of the writing process. Whatever it is, I hope you'll join me next time. And so, I'll catch you next time, folks, and I'll see you then. Later.